Chapter 1. The Governor's Garden Party. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculate lawns of the governor's residence in Hong Kong, bathing the gathering in a golden light that softened even the most severe British colonial architecture. Jane Parsons watched with quiet amusement as servants in crisp white uniforms weaved through clusters of expatriates and local dignitaries, bearing trays of champagne that sparkled like liquid amber in the fading daylight. A soft breeze carried the mingled scents of jasmine, expensive perfume, and the distant tang of the harbour. "Miss Parsons, what a delightful surprise!" Lady Armstrong's voice cut through Jane's contemplation. The governor's wife approached with the practised grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of colonial hospitality. "I had no idea you were in Hong Kong. Edward will be thrilled." Jane smiled and accepted a flute of champagne from a passing servant. "My arrival was rather impromptu, I'm afraid. I was in Shanghai when I received your husband's invitation. It seemed too fortuitous to decline." Lady Armstrong lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between us, I believe Edward invited you with a purpose beyond social niceties. The British Museum has lent us several remarkable artefacts for tomorrow's exhibition opening. Priceless jade and silk treasures from the Imperial collection." She glanced around before continuing. "There have been concerns." "Concerns of what nature?" Jane asked. Her interest piqued despite her resolve to enjoy a true holiday for once. "Threats, nothing explicit. But Edward received an anonymous note suggesting that allowing these treasures to be displayed outside China would bring misfortune." Lady Armstrong shivered slightly despite the warmth of the evening. "Superstitious nonsense, of course, but with tensions as they are." The conversation halted as a commotion rippled through the assembled guests. A slender Chinese man in Western, formal wear was making his way toward them, his face a mask of composed dignity that contrasted with the obvious discomfort of those around him. Behind him trailed a young Eurasian woman in a stunning red kipao, her features a harmonious blend of East and West. "Lady Armstrong." The man bowed slightly. "Thank you for your hospitality. May I present my daughter, Li Ming?" Lady Armstrong's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Chen, how good of you to come. Your daughter looks lovely." Jane observed the subtle undercurrents of tension with interest. Chen Wei was a name known throughout Hong Kong and beyond. A wealthy merchant whose business interests spanned continents, but whose sympathies were rumoured to lie with Chinese nationalism rather than British imperialism. "Miss Parsons," Lady Armstrong continued, "may I introduce Mr. Chen Wei and his daughter, Li Ming. Mr. Chen, this is Miss Jane Parsons, a dear friend from London." Chen's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "The detective! Your reputation precedes you, Miss Parsons." "I prefer private investigator," Jane replied smoothly, "though I'm merely a tourist at present." Li Ming stepped forward, her gaze direct and intelligent. "Father speaks of your work with great admiration, Miss Parsons, particularly your resolution of the Forbidden City affair last year." Before Jane could respond, a tall man with a carefully trimmed moustache joined their circle. "Jane Parsons! By God, it really is you!" Colonel Harrington's booming voice drew several glances. "What brings our finest investigative mind to this corner of the Empire?" "A simple pleasure, Colonel," Jane replied, noting how Chen Wei and his daughter stiffened at Harrington's arrival, though I find that curiosities tend to find me regardless of my intentions. Speaking of curiosities, Harrington continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension, I hope you'll attend tomorrow's exhibition. Some remarkable pieces, though I maintain they belong in British museums rather than being returned to their rightful owners. Leeming interjected, her voice soft but edged with steel. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Chen placed a restraining hand on his daughter's arm. Leeming has studied art history at Oxford, he explained with a tight smile. She feels strongly about cultural heritage. Colonel Harrington's face flushed slightly. Yes, well, complex diplomatic matters are rarely solved at garden parties. From across the lawn came the delicate sound of a gong, signalling dinner. As the guests began to move toward the illuminated pavilion erected for the evening, Jane noticed a figure hovering at the edge of the garden. A European man in his 30s with scholarly features, watching Chen Wei and his daughter with undisguised interest. Lady Armstrong followed Jane's gaze. Professor Malcolm Reed, our curator for the exhibition. Brilliant mind, though perhaps lacking in social graces. He's been positively obsessed with the Chen family since arriving. Oh? Jane raised an eyebrow. Any particular reason? The jewel of our exhibition, an ancient jade burial mask, apparently once belonged to Chen's ancestors. The professor has been attempting to interview him about family records without much success. As the guests processed toward dinner, Jane noticed a servant discreetly pass a folded note to Chen Wei. The merchant's expression remained impassive as he slipped the paper into his pocket, but Jane didn't miss the momentary tightening of his jaw. The dinner pavilion glowed like a lantern against the darkening sky. Silk panels in vibrant red and gold billowing gently in the evening breeze. Strings of paper lanterns swayed overhead, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow across the assembled dignitaries. Jane was seated between a shipping magnate's widow and a young naval officer, with Chen Wei and his daughter placed directly across from her. Throughout the elaborate meal, Jane observed the silent drama unfolding around her. The way Professor Reed stared at Leeming when he thought no one was watching. The conspicuous absence of Lady Armstrong's personal maid, who had been present earlier. The slight tremor in Chen Wei's hand when he reached for his wine glass after reading the mysterious note. As dessert was served, delicate almond cakes with jasmine-infused cream. A commotion erupted from the direction of the main house. A young Chinese servant burst into the pavilion, his face ashen. "Forgive the interruption, Your Excellency," he addressed the governor, "but there has been an incident in the exhibition room." The governor rose immediately. "What sort of incident?" "The jade burial mask, sir. It's gone." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Jane noticed that while most guests registered shock, Chen Wei's expression held something closer to resignation, and Professor Reed looked more intrigued than disturbed. "And that's not all, sir," the servant continued, his voice dropping. "Lady Armstrong's maid, Miss Liu, she's been found unconscious beside the empty display case." In the ensuing chaos, as guests whispered and the governor barked orders for the grounds to be secured, Jane caught Leeming's gaze across the table. The young woman's eyes held a curious mixture of apprehension and challenge. She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely audible above the din. "Perhaps you are not merely a tourist after all, Miss Parsons." Jane took a measured sip of wine, the sweet jasmine scent of the pavilion now undercut by something sharper, the familiar scent of mystery and danger intertwined. "It would appear not," she replied softly, already mentally unpacking her detective's kit from her trunk. The Hong Kong sunset had delivered her not into relaxation, but into the opening movements of a new and complex investigation, one where ancient treasures and modern politics would weave a deadly dance beneath the Silken Pavilion. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Exhibition Hall. Morning light filtered through the ornate windows of the governor's residence, casting geometric patterns across the marble floor of the exhibition hall. Jane stood perfectly still, absorbing every detail. The display case at the centre of the room remained open, its velvet lining undisturbed save for the conspicuous absence of the jade burial mask. No signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, merely an empty space where priceless history had rested hours before. "We've questioned the staff through half the night," Governor Armstrong said, passing a handkerchief across his brow. The morning was already warm, heavy with humidity that promised an oppressive day. No one saw anything unusual until Miss Liu was discovered. "And the young woman's condition?" Jane inquired. "Stable, but still unconscious. The doctor suggests she was drugged, rather than struck," Lady Armstrong replied. "Chloral hydrate, he believes." "Curious that only the mask was taken," Jane observed. "The other pieces are equally valuable." The governor frowned. "The jade mask is the centrepiece, certainly, but these gold-threaded silk scrolls are worth a small fortune." Jane knelt gracefully beside a nearly imperceptible scuff mark on the floor, running a gloved finger along the marble. "Has Professor Reed examined the scene? He was here at dawn, taking photographs and notes like a man possessed," Lady Armstrong said, her expression tightening. "I've never seen such excitement over a theft." Jane requested to speak with Miss Liu when she woke and asked for a complete guest list. The governor offered military police assistance, which Jane politely declined, preferring her more discreet methods. After the Armstrongs departed, Jane continued her careful inspection until a soft footfall broke her concentration. "Miss Parsons, I hoped I might find you here." Jane turned to find Li Ming Chen standing in the doorway, practical day dress replacing her evening finery, though still of impeccable quality. "I'm surprised the governor's staff admitted visitors so early." A hint of a smile crossed Li Ming's face. "My father has certain privileges, despite his complicated relationship with the colonial authorities." She approached the empty display case. "I understand you've been asked to investigate. Word travels quickly in Hong Kong, in certain circles." Li Ming clasped her hands. "I've come to offer my assistance." "How might you assist, Miss Chen? I know things about that mask that Professor Reed and his British Museum colleagues do not." Her voice dropped. "Things that aren't recorded in their meticulous catalogues." The exhibition hall door opened again, admitting Professor Reed. He stopped abruptly at the sight of Li Ming, his scholarly demeanour momentarily disrupted. "Miss Chen," he acknowledged stiffly before turning to Jane. "Miss Parsons, I presume. The governor mentioned you would be conducting inquiries." "I understand you were first to examine the scene this morning," Jane noted. "Professional obligation," he replied. "These artifacts are under my care, The mask in particular is irreplaceable, 9th century, from the Tang dynasty. The craftsmanship is unparalleled. Li Ming's expression cooled. The mask has significance beyond its artistic merit, Professor. It has spiritual importance to the family from which it was acquired. Reed adjusted his spectacles. The British Museum's provenance records are quite thorough. The mask was purchased legitimately from a merchant in Shanghai in 1886. A merchant who had no right to sell it, Li Ming countered, her composure intact despite the emotion Jane detected beneath her words. Professor, would there be a market for such an item if someone wished to sell it? Jane asked. Certainly. Private collectors in America would pay handsomely, no questions asked. Several European museums as well. He hesitated, though anyone with knowledge of Chinese artifacts would recognize it immediately. Making it difficult to sell openly, Jane mused, unless the thief never intended to sell it, Li Ming interjected, unless its value to them was something other than monetary. Reed studied Li Ming with narrowed eyes. You refer to its return to China. Li Ming met his gaze without flinching. I merely suggest alternative motives, Professor. Colonel Harrington strode in, his presence disrupting the delicate balance of the conversation. As he pulled Reed aside about security measures, Li Ming turned to Jane. My father would like to invite you to tea this afternoon at our home on Victoria Peak. There are aspects of this situation that cannot be discussed here. Is your father concerned about the missing mask, Miss Chen? Something flickered in Li Ming's eyes. Caution, perhaps, or calculation. My father is concerned about many things. The mask is merely one thread in a complex tapestry. After arranging to meet Li Ming at 3 o'clock, Jane visited the hospital where Miss Liu was recovering. The young woman had awakened briefly, but remembered nothing beyond serving drinks in the garden. She did mention something strange, the nurse added. Before drifting off again, she asked if the silk birds were still flying. Silk birds? Jane inquired. Delirium, most likely. The doctor says the drug may cause confusion. Jane wasn't so certain. As she departed, she made a note to inquire about decorative birds at the exhibition. By midday, Jane returned to her hotel to review her notes. The case presented intriguing contradictions. A theft without force, a specific artifact targeted, a drugged servant with strange memories. In her room, Jane found an envelope slipped beneath her door. Inside was a delicate rice paper drawing of a burial mask, surrounded by flying birds with ribbon-like tails. Beneath the image, a single line of elegant calligraphy. Some treasures belong to the spirits. Jane studied the mysterious message, noticing details of the mask she hadn't observed in the exhibition photographs, particularly a small inscription along the jade's edge, another puzzle piece delivered by an unknown hand. Outside her window, Hong Kong harbour stretched into the distance, merchant ships and naval vessels floating side by side in uneasy harmony, much like the colonial city itself. Jane carefully folded the drawing and placed it in her pocket. It was nearly time to discover what secrets the Chen family wished to share, and what motives they might have for the mask's disappearance. Chapter 3. Tea at Victoria Peak. The sedan chair-bearers wound their way up Victoria Peak, the rhythm of their footsteps as steady as a metronome, despite the steep incline. Jane gazed through the curtained window at Hong Kong's dramatic topography. The harbour growing smaller below, while British colonial mansions gave way to more distinctive Chinese architecture as they ascended. The Chen residence emerged around a bend in the road, its presence both imposing and serene, traditional in design, yet adapted for a merchant prince of Chen Wei's stature. The house nestled among carefully landscaped gardens, where ancient trees provided pools of dappled shade against the afternoon heat. A servant in simple but immaculate attire greeted Jane at the entrance and led her through a series of courtyards, each more intimate than the last. Water trickled from stone fountains, while birds called softly from bamboo cages hung in the eaves. The juxtaposition of captivity and freedom was not lost on Jane. In the innermost courtyard, beneath a pavilion of carved wood and green tile, Chen Wei sat at a low table. Before him, an elderly servant performed an elaborate tea ceremony, his gnarled hands moving with practiced precision. "Miss Parsons," Chen rose slightly, inclining his head, "you honour my humble home." Jane returned the gesture. "The honour is mine, Mr. Chen. Your home is exquisite." "Please," he gestured to the cushion opposite him, "join me for tea before we discuss matters of consequence." Jane settled gracefully, noting the absence of Li Ming. The tea-master poured the steaming liquid into porcelain cups so delicate they appeared translucent. Jane observed Chen's face as she sipped. The merchant's expression was carefully neutral, yet she detected subtle tension around his eyes. "My daughter has been unavoidably detained," Chen explained as if reading her thoughts. "She sends her apologies. I hope nothing serious has occurred." Something flickered in Chen's eyes. "Li Ming visits her mother's ancestral temple on occasion. These are spiritually significant days in our calendar." Jane set down her cup. "The invitation suggested you might have insights regarding the missing mask." Chen studied her for a moment. "You are direct, Miss Parsons. A quality I admire, though it is not always valued in either British or Chinese society." He dismissed the tea-master with a slight gesture. Once they were alone, he continued. "The mask taken from the governor's residence was not merely an artifact. It was a guardian. A guardian? In the 9th century, it was created to protect the tomb of my ancestor, Chen Lin. He was a court official who fell from the emperor's favour. The mask bears inscriptions, prayers and protective charms meant to secure safe passage to the afterlife." Jane thought of the drawing delivered to her hotel room. Inscriptions that might include references to birds? Chen's expression sharpened. "You have seen the inscription." "I've seen a drawing," Jane admitted. "Anonymous, delivered to my hotel." Chen relaxed slightly. "The birds represent messengers between worlds. The mask was created to ensure these messengers would carry Chen Lin's spirit safely to his ancestors. Your family clearly values this connection to the past," Jane observed. "Yet the mask has been in British possession for decades. Why has its return become urgent now?" Chen's gaze drifted to the garden. "There is a belief that when such sacred objects are removed from their rightful place, misfortune follows. My grandfather tried to prevent the sale, but he was overruled. By whom? His son, my father. A man who valued commerce over tradition." Chen's voice remained steady, but Jane detected old pain beneath his words. "Now there are signs that the spirits are displeased." "Signs?" Chen hesitated. 3 nights ago, before the theft, The ancestral temple where Li Ming is now praying reported strange occurrences. Candles extinguishing simultaneously, offerings displaced, and a monk claimed to see a figure in ancient court dress watching from the shadows. Jane considered this information carefully. "Mr. Chen, forgive my directness, but I must ask, did you or Li Ming arrange for the mask's removal from the exhibition?" "A reasonable question," Chen acknowledged without offence. "The answer is no. While I desire its return to our family temple, theft would bring dishonour. I have been negotiating with the British Museum for a legitimate acquisition." Professor Reed did not mention these negotiations. Professor Reed, Chen's tone cooled noticeably, has been obstructive. He believes the mask's historical significance outweighs its spiritual importance. A servant appeared silently at the pavilion entrance, bowing deeply. "Master, a messenger has arrived from the temple. It is urgent." Chen's composure wavered momentarily. He spoke rapidly in Cantonese, receiving a whispered reply that caused him to rise abruptly. "Miss Parsons, I apologize, but I must attend to a family matter. My carriage will return you to your hotel." He hesitated. "One final piece of information. Professor Reed has been making inquiries about our family history that go beyond professional interest. He has sought access to private records dating back to the Ming dynasty." "For what purpose?" "That," Chen said as he prepared to depart, "is what troubles me. The records he seeks detail not only the mask, but also the location of Chen Lin's undiscovered tomb, and the priceless treasures buried with him." As Jane was escorted to Chen's carriage, she noticed a figure watching from an upper window, not Li Ming as she first thought, but an older woman, her stern face framed by silver hair. Their eyes met briefly before the woman withdrew into the shadows. Descending from Victoria Peak, Jane pondered the layers of the case. A stolen mask, ancient spiritual beliefs, and hints of a hidden tomb containing untold treasures. As the carriage rounded a bend, a rider on horseback passed in the opposite direction. Colonel Harrington, his usually impeccable uniform dusty from hard riding. He appeared not to notice her. At the hotel, a message awaited from the hospital. Miss Liu had awakened fully and was asking specifically for the English lady detective. Changing quickly, Jane made her way to the Colonial Hospital as evening shadows lengthened across Hong Kong. The mystery of the mask was expanding like ripples in still water, touching unexpected shores. And Jane sensed that somewhere in those ripples lurked dangers yet to surface. Ancient and modern threats converging in the silken pavilions of Hong Kong. Chapter 4. The Maid's Testimony. Dusk settled over Hong Kong as Jane arrived at the Colonial Hospital, its whitewashed facade tinged amber in the fading light. Inside, the halls were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of nurses' uniforms and the distant moans of the suffering. The antiseptic smell, familiar in hospitals the world over, mingled with the scent of jasmine tea being served to patients able to take refreshment. Miss Liu had been moved to a small private room. A courtesy. "From the governor," the attending nurse explained, as the young woman was still considered a witness in an official investigation. Jane found her sitting upright in bed, her black hair neatly braided, her complexion still pallid, but her eyes clear and alert. "Miss Parsons," she said in accented English, inclining her head slightly. "Thank you for coming." Jane settled into the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling, Miss Liu?" "My head aches, but the doctor says it will pass." Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her blanket. "They tell me I was drugged." "Do you remember anything about last night? Anything unusual you noticed while serving at the party?" Miss Liu's gaze dropped to her hands. "That is why I asked for you. I remember something, but I fear it may cause trouble." "I assure you, my investigation is independent. I seek only the truth." The young woman studied Jane for a long moment, as though measuring her trustworthiness. Finally, she spoke in a hushed voice. "I was assigned to serve in the exhibition room. Most guests were in the garden or the dining pavilion, but I was to offer tea to anyone who came to view the artifacts early." "Did many guests visit the exhibition?" "Few. Lady Armstrong showed some ladies the silk scrolls. Colonel Harrington brought 2 military friends to see the weapons collection." She hesitated. "Professor Reed came alone near sunset. He spent a long time with the jade mask, making notes in a small book." Jane nodded encouragingly. "What else?" "Later, I saw Miss Chen, Li Ming, enter the exhibition. She did not know. I was there, arranging cups in the adjoining room. She approached the mask and she spoke to it." "Spoke to it?" Jane leaned forward slightly. "What did she say?" "It was in an old dialect, formal Chinese. A prayer, I think." Miss Liu's voice dropped further. She placed something beside the mask, a small scroll tied with red thread. Then she left quickly. Jane made a mental note of this unrevealed visit. And after that? Near the end of dinner, I was serving tea in the small drawing room when Professor Reed returned to the exhibition. He seemed agitated. He examined the mask again, then noticed the scroll. He read it and his face. She struggled to find the words. It was like watching a man receive unexpected news. Shock, then calculation. Did he take the scroll? Yes. He placed it in his pocket and looked around to ensure no one had seen. I pretended to be busy with the tea service. Miss Liu's account was becoming increasingly valuable. "When did you last see the mask?" "Just before I lost consciousness. I was replacing the tea service when I heard voices in the exhibition. Professor Reed and another man. They were arguing in low voices." "Could you identify the other man?" She shook her head. "He spoke English with no accent. They stood in shadow. I heard only fragments. Something about rightful ownership, and the map is incomplete without it." What happened then? I felt suddenly dizzy. My tea service. I dropped a cup. They must have heard, because the voices stopped. I tried to reach the door, but my legs wouldn't obey. As I fell, I saw she frowned, concentrating. I saw silk birds on the ceiling, moving as though flying. Were there decorative birds in the exhibition room? No. Miss Liu looked troubled. That is what confuses me. The ceiling was painted with clouds only, yet I clearly saw birds with long ribbon tails, like those sewn on ceremonial robes. They seemed to be circling above the mask display. Jane recalled the drawing left at her hotel, the mask surrounded by similar birds. "You're certain about this detail?" "As certain as one can be when drugged," Miss Liu replied with unexpected irony. "It is the last thing I remember before waking here." As Jane departed the hospital, night had fully claimed Hong Kong. Lanterns illuminated the colonial district, while across the harbour the ancient city glowed with a different quality of light, warmer, more diffuse, two worlds coexisting, yet separate. Rather than returning directly to her hotel, Jane made her way to the governor's residence. The guards recognized her now, admitting her with minimal formality. The exhibition room stood empty, the remaining artifacts having been relocated to more secure quarters after the theft. Jane stood in the centre of the room, looking up at the ceiling. As Miss Liu had stated, it was painted with decorative clouds in the Chinese style, but no birds. She moved to the display case where the mask had rested, examining it once more in the quiet of evening. A subtle discoloration on the velvet caught her eye. A small stain, not blood but something else. Jane removed a small magnifying glass from her handbag and studied the mark more closely. Ink. Chinese ink, with the faintest trace of red thread embedded in its edge. The scroll Li Ming had left, presumably. But why place it beside the mask? A message, a warning. And what had it contained that so affected Professor Reed? As Jane straightened, she heard a footstep in the corridor. Instinctively, she stepped into the shadow of a large cabinet. The door opened, and Lady Armstrong entered, accompanied by Colonel Harrington. Neither appeared to notice Jane's presence. "This is most irregular, Edward," Lady Armstrong was saying, her voice tense. "My husband would not approve." "Your husband need not know," Harrington replied. "The situation has become more complicated than a simple theft. Chen Wei visited the temple today where ancestral records are kept. My sources tell me he removed several documents dating back centuries. What concern is that of ours? Those documents may contain information about the tomb location. If Reed's theories are correct, the mask is merely the key to a much greater treasure." Harrington's voice hardened. "A treasure that rightfully belongs to the Empire, not to a Chinese merchant with nationalist sympathies." "And what of Miss Parsons's investigation? A convenient distraction. Let her chase shadows while we pursue the substance." They moved deeper into the room, their voices fading to murmurs too quiet for Jane to discern. She remained motionless in the shadows, processing this new information. After several minutes, they departed, leaving Jane alone with her thoughts. The case was expanding beyond a simple theft. Ancient treasures, colonial ambitions, family honor, and spiritual beliefs, all converging around a jade mask with the power to guide souls between worlds. As Jane finally slipped away from the governor's residence, she felt a peculiar sensation of being watched. Glancing up at the night sky, she saw nothing but stars. Yet for an instant, she could almost imagine ribbon-tailed birds circling overhead, observing her progress through the darkened streets of Hong Kong. Chapter 5. The Hidden Warning Dawn broke over Hong Kong harbour with a symphony of sounds. The creaking of ships' timbers, calls of early market vendors, and the rhythmic chanting from nearby temples. Jane stood at her hotel window, watching sampans navigate the misty waters as she contemplated her next move. The anonymous drawing of the mask with its flying birds lay on her writing desk, alongside notes from her conversation with Miss Liu and observations from her clandestine encounter at the governor's residence. Patterns were emerging, yet crucial pieces remained elusive. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. A hotel attendant delivered a message on expensive stationery, embossed with the British Museum's crest. Professor Reed requested the pleasure of her company for breakfast at the Hong Kong Club, an establishment typically closed to women, but which made exceptions for the wives and guests of prominent British officials. Donning a morning dress of pale blue linen, Jane made her way to the colonial stronghold on the waterfront. The club's interior was a carefully constructed echo of London gentlemen's clubs, all polished wood, leather chairs, and the day's newspapers arranged precisely on reading tables. The exclusively male membership regarded her with barely concealed surprise as a Chinese steward led her to a private alcove where Professor Reed awaited. "Miss Parsons," he rose, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. Your note suggested urgency, Professor." Indeed. He waited until the steward had poured their tea and retreated. "I understand you visited Miss Liu yesterday." Jane raised an eyebrow. "News travels quickly. Hong Kong thrives on information." Reed stirred his tea unnecessarily. "What did she tell you?" "I'm curious why you ask, Professor. Have you spoken with her yourself?" "The governor has restricted access. Only yourself and the medical staff." A trace of irritation crossed his scholarly features. I had hoped to clarify certain observations she might have made. Jane sipped her tea, observing him over the rim. "Regarding the night of the theft." "Precisely." His fingers drummed lightly on the tablecloth. "Did she mention seeing anyone unusual near the exhibition room?" "Several people visited the display throughout the evening," Jane replied noncommittally. "You among them?" Reed's expression tightened momentarily. "Yes, naturally. The artifacts were under my supervision." He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. "Miss Parsons, I've invited you here because I believe we might assist one another." He withdrew a small object wrapped in silk and placed it between them. Carefully unfolding the fabric, he revealed a fragment of jade, a broken corner piece that matched the distinctive green hue of the stolen mask. "Where did you get this?" Jane asked, her voice steady despite her surprise. "It was delivered to my quarters yesterday. No note, no explanation, simply this fragment wrapped in red silk." His voice lowered. "The break is recent. Someone has deliberately damaged the mask." Jane studied the fragment without touching it. "Or wishes you to believe they have." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You suspect a ruse." "I consider all possibilities, Professor, including why the bearer of this fragment chose to deliver it to you rather than to the authorities. Perhaps because I recognize its significance beyond mere monetary value." He rewrapped the fragment carefully. "The mask is more than a museum piece, Miss Parsons. It contains secrets, historical secrets that could reshape our understanding of Tang Dynasty burial practices, and possibly lead to undiscovered treasures," Jane suggested. Reed's gaze sharpened. "You've been speaking with Chen Wei. He mentioned your interest in his family records." "Academic interest only." Reed's tone grew defensive. "The Chen family possesses scrolls documenting burial sites that scholars believed lost centuries ago. Historical treasures hidden from the world in private family shrines." "Private family history," Jane corrected gently. "There is a distinction." Reed dismissed this with a gesture. "Knowledge belongs to humanity, not to a single family. Particularly knowledge that might lead to archaeological discoveries of immense value. Both cultural and monetary value, I imagine. A flash of annoyance crossed his face. The British Museum compensates handsomely for significant acquisitions. Jane returned to the jade fragment. You believe this was sent as a message? A warning, perhaps? Reed lowered his voice further. There are rumours in the Chinese quarter of a secret society, guardians of ancestral tombs who oppose foreign excavations. They call themselves the Keepers of Eternal Memory. And you believe they've taken the mask? It's possible, though why damage it? He shook his head. The mask's value lies partly in its inscriptions. Damaging it risks destroying crucial information. Jane thought of the birds on the drawing, the inscription along the edge. Unless the damage was calculated to preserve certain information while destroying other details. Reed looked startled. What makes you suggest that? Before Jane could respond, a commotion arose at the club entrance. Colonel Harrington strode in, accompanied by 2 military policemen. His gaze swept the room until it settled on their alcove. I must go, Reed said hastily, pocketing the jade fragment. Miss Parsons, I advise discretion regarding our conversation. Not everyone involved in this affair has purely academic interests. He slipped away through a side door as Harrington approached, the colonel's face darkening at the professor's departure. Miss Parsons, Harrington acknowledged stiffly. I'm surprised to find you in the company of Professor Reed. A chance encounter, Colonel, Jane replied smoothly. The professor was sharing his expertise on Tang Dynasty artifacts. Harrington's skepticism was evident. Indeed, you should know that the professor's credentials are being reviewed. Certain inconsistencies have emerged in his background. What sort of inconsistencies? His claimed excavation experience in Shaanxi province cannot be verified. Harrington signalled to the steward for tea. And his correspondence with certain Chinese nationals has raised concerns about divided loyalties. Jane absorbed this information carefully. Has he been in contact with the Chen family before his appointment to this exhibition? Harrington's eyes narrowed. What has he told you? Nothing of consequence, Colonel. I'm simply exploring connections. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger in Government House livery. He delivered an envelope to Harrington, who read the contents with growing tension in his jaw. You'll have to excuse me, Miss Parsons. A situation requires my attention. He rose abruptly. I would caution you about pursuing this investigation too vigorously. Hong Kong harbours dangers that even someone of your experience might find overwhelming. After Harrington's departure, Jane lingered to finish her tea. The club had nearly emptied as members departed for their daily affairs. In the quiet, she noticed something beneath Reed's vacated chair. A small slip of paper, perhaps fallen from his pocket in his hasty exit. Jane retrieved it discreetly. A portion of a map, torn from a larger document, showing what appeared to be mountain contours, with Chinese characters noting a western approach. And in the corner, drawn in red ink, the now familiar silhouette of a bird with ribbon-like tail. She departed the Hong Kong club. Jane's mind worked rapidly through these new developments. Reed's jade fragment, Harrington's suspicions, and the map fragment with its distinctive bird marking, all pieces of an increasingly dangerous puzzle. At the hotel entrance, Jane was surprised to find Li Ming Chen waiting, her usual composed demeanour replaced by barely concealed distress. "Miss Parsons," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "my father has disappeared." Chapter 6. Shadows in the Temple. "When did you last see your father?" Jane asked as their rickshaw wound through Hong Kong's crowded streets. Li Ming had insisted they speak away from the hotel, where colonial ears might overhear. "Yesterday afternoon, after he sent you back to your hotel." Li Ming's usual composure had fractured, revealing genuine fear beneath. "He left for the temple where I had been earlier. He was meant to return for dinner, but never arrived." "The temple where the ancestral records are kept?" Li Ming's gaze sharpened. "How do you know about that?" "Information has a way of surfacing," Jane replied carefully. "Your father mentioned you visited this temple regularly." The rickshaw turned onto a narrow street lined with shops displaying intricate wood carvings and silk embroidery. Li Ming directed the driver to stop before a modest tea house, its entrance partially concealed behind hanging baskets of fragrant herbs. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the earthy aroma of oolong. Li Ming guided Jane to a private alcove, in the rear, separated from the main room by carved screens. Once seated, she leaned forward, speaking in hushed tones. "My father went to the temple to secure our family records. There had been intrusions by Professor Reed." A flicker of surprise crossed Li Ming's face. "Yes, how did you—" "The professor has taken a particular interest in your family history," Jane explained. "Specifically, records that might lead to your ancestor Chen Lin's tomb." Li Ming's fingers tightened around her teacup. "The professor is not who he claims to be. Colonel Harrington suggested as much this morning." "And you trust the colonel?" Jane smiled slightly. "I trust evidence, Miss Chen, and careful observation." She withdrew the map fragment she'd recovered at the Hong Kong Club. "Does this appear familiar to you?" Li Ming's intake of breath was barely audible as she studied the torn paper. "Where did you get this?" "From Professor Reed, inadvertently. He seems to be collecting pieces of a larger puzzle." Li Ming glanced around the tea house before responding. "This is part of a sacred map. It shows the hidden approach to the Valley of Eternal Rest, where many Tang Dynasty officials, including my ancestor, were secretly buried after falling from imperial favour. And the bird marking? The emblem of the Guardian Society, what your professor called the Keepers of Eternal Memory." Li Ming traced the red silhouette with a fingertip. "They have protected these tombs for centuries, ensuring that those who were dishonoured in life might rest undisturbed in death." Jane considered this new information. "You believe your father's disappearance is connected to these guardians?" "No," Li Ming's response was immediate. "The guardians would never harm my father. We are descendants of those they protect." Her voice lowered further. "I fear the British have taken him, perhaps because of what he knows, or what they believe he possesses." "The mask?" Li Ming shook her head. "My father doesn't have the mask, but he has something perhaps more valuable. The complete map to Chen Lin's tomb, and knowledge of the rituals required to safely enter it." Jane thought of Harrington's hasty departure from the Hong Kong Club after receiving an urgent message. Would Colonel Harrington be involved in such an action? "The Colonel serves empire before justice," Li Ming replied bitterly. And Chen Lin's tomb is rumoured to contain treasures beyond price, jade, gold, and ancient texts describing alchemical secrets lost to time. A waiter approached with fresh tea, causing both women to fall silent until he departed. Jane used the interruption to study Li Ming more carefully. The tension in her shoulders, the subtle tremor in her hands despite her controlled exterior. "There's something you haven't told me," Jane observed quietly. Li Ming met her gaze directly. "The night of the theft, I left a message beside the mask, a warning written in classical Chinese. It stated that removing the mask from Hong Kong would awaken the curse of Chen Lin. You mentioned no curse before. It is not something we discuss with outsiders." Li Ming hesitated. 3 previous attempts to locate the tomb have ended in disaster. The last expedition, led by a German archaeologist in 1912, resulted in all 7 members dying of a mysterious illness within days of claiming to have found the entrance. "You believe in this curse?" Li Ming's expression was unreadable. "What I believe is irrelevant. What matters is that others believe, including Professor Reed, though he would never admit it publicly. The fragment of jade he showed you this morning was his attempt to test its power." Jane's surprise must have shown on her face, for Li Ming smiled thinly. "Yes, I know of your meeting. Hong Kong thrives on information, as the professor himself noted." Her smile faded. "The mask is said to offer protection from the curse, but only if it remains whole. By breaking it, he risks not only his own fate, but that of anyone who enters the tomb." Before Jane could respond, the tea-house door burst open. A young Chinese man in Western clothing approached their table with urgent steps, speaking rapidly to Li Ming in Cantonese. Her face paled as she listened. "What is it?" Jane asked when he finished. "My father's carriage has been found abandoned, near the Western Monastery. His driver was discovered nearby, unconscious but alive." Li Ming rose swiftly. "I must go to him immediately." Jane gathered her belongings. "I'll accompany you." The young man led them through back streets to where a motorcar waited, a rarity in Hong Kong and a sign of Li Ming's family wealth. Denshu, they drove toward the outskirts of the city. Jane noted the driver took an evasive route, doubling back several times as if to shed potential followers. The Western Monastery perched on a mountainside overlooking the sea, its ancient walls seemingly grown from the very stone of the mountain. As they ascended the winding road, Jane observed British military personnel at the monastery gates, their presence incongruous against the sacred architecture. "They're here already," Li Ming whispered, tension evident in every line of her body. Their driver stopped a discreet distance from the entrance. "We cannot approach directly," the young man explained. "There is another way through the gardener's path." As they skirted the monastery walls, following a narrow trail through bamboo groves, Jane caught glimpses of activity within the courtyard. Soldiers forming search parties, officers consulting maps. At the centre of this activity stood Colonel Harrington, issuing commands with military precision. They entered through a small side gate where an elderly monk awaited them. His deeply lined face registered recognition upon seeing Li Ming, followed by grave concern. "Where is my father's driver?" Li Ming asked without preamble. "In the infirmary." He regained consciousness briefly, but spoke only of shadows that moved, like birds, and a British voice that commanded in perfect Cantonese. The monk glanced at Jane with undisguised suspicion. "Miss Parsons is here to help," Leeming assured him. "What of my father? Have the British found him?" The monk shook his head. "They search, but the monastery keeps its secrets. Your father came here yesterday to secure the ancestral scrolls, as you know. He placed them in the hidden chamber beneath the Hall of Ancestors. And now? The scrolls remain safe. But we found this in the meditation garden." From his sleeve, the monk withdrew a small object wrapped in white silk. Leeming unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside lay a broken piece of jade. Another fragment of the mask, identical in colour to the piece Reed had shown Jane that morning. "There was a message with it," the monk continued, his voice heavy with foreboding. "Written in blood on the garden wall. The Guardian is broken. The way is open." Leeming's face drained of colour. "Then it has already begun." Chapter 7. Jane's strategic play Twilight descended over the Western Monastery, transforming its ancient stones from gold to deepening blue. Jane and Leeming had retreated to a small meditation chamber, safely removed from the British military, presence that continued to search the grounds with increasing frustration. "They won't find what they're looking for," the elderly monk had assured them before departing to mislead the soldiers further. "The sacred texts are well hidden." Jane studied the jade fragment in the lantern light, comparing it mentally to the piece Reed had shown her. 2 fragments discovered on the same day. It cannot be coincidence. "It is a message," Leeming replied, her composure gradually returning despite her concern for her father. "The mask has been deliberately broken into pieces. By whom? That is the question." Leeming traced the broken edge of jade. "My father believed Professor Reed sought the mask to gain entrance to the tomb, but perhaps his intention was to destroy it all along, to remove the protection it offers." Jane considered this possibility. "The professor struck me as ambitious, certainly, but would he risk this curse you describe?" "Men of science often dismiss what they cannot explain," Leeming said softly, "until they cannot dismiss it any longer." From outside, they heard the sharp commands of Colonel Harrington, his voice echoing against stone walls. The military search was becoming more aggressive as darkness fell. Jane made a decision. "We cannot wait for them to leave. Your father is missing, the mask is broken, and time may be running short." She reached into her handbag, removing a small notebook. "I believe I can determine where the mask, and likely your father, have been taken, but I'll need to examine those ancestral scrolls you mentioned." Leeming hesitated, studying Jane's face in the flickering light. "The scrolls have never been seen by Western eyes." "I don't seek them for their historical value," Jane assured her. "Only for what they might tell us about your father's whereabouts." "Modestios." A long moment, Leeming nodded. "Follow me, and step exactly where I step." They slipped from the meditation chamber into a narrow corridor, illuminated only by a single oil lamp Leeming carried. The passage descended beneath the monastery, the air growing cooler and heavy with the scent of incense and ancient paper. At a seemingly blank wall, Leeming pressed a sequence of carved lotus blossoms, revealing a hidden door that opened silently on well-oiled hinges. The chamber beyond took Jane's breath away. Scrolls lined recessed shelves carved directly into the living rock, some clearly ancient, others more recent. At the centre stood a stone table, illuminated by oil lamps that appeared to have burned continuously for centuries, their flames perfectly still in the undisturbed air. The collected wisdom and history of 17 generations, Li-Ming said quietly. My father came here yesterday to consult the oldest scrolls, those pertaining to Chen Lin's burial. Were any taken? No, the scrolls never leave this chamber. Li-Ming approached a locked cabinet of red lacquer. From beneath her collar, she withdrew a small key on a silk cord. But my father made notes. The cabinet contained a leather-bound journal, its pages covered in meticulous Chinese characters interspersed with hand-drawn maps. Li-Ming spread it carefully on the stone table. My father believed he had finally located the true entrance to Chen Lin's tomb, not in the Valley of Eternal Rest where most believed it to be, but in a hidden cave system beneath Lion Rock. Jane compared this information with the map fragment she'd acquired from Reed. The contours matched perfectly. And the fragment you showed me earlier? It's part of a map to this location. Yes, the complete map was divided into 4 sections, centuries ago, as a safeguard. Each section was entrusted to a different branch of Guardians. Li-Ming turned several pages in the journal. My father spent decades locating and copying each section. He completed the final piece just last week. Jane studied the assembled map in Chen's journal. And you believe whoever has taken your father is using his knowledge to find the tomb? I fear they may have already found it. Li-Ming pointed to her father's most recent entry, dated the previous day. The characters were hastily written, the brushwork uncharacteristically erratic. He writes of seeing someone following him from the governor's residence, someone he recognized but did not expect. Does he name this person? No, but he notes something strange. The person wore Western clothes but moved like a temple-trained shadow. Li-Ming looked troubled. Few Europeans receive such training. Jane thought of Reed's inexplicable knowledge of Chinese dialects, his questionable credentials. The professor? Perhaps, or someone else entirely. Li-Ming turned another page, revealing a detailed drawing of the jade mask, complete with inscriptions along its edge. My father copied the mask's protective incantation here. It must be spoken aloud upon entering the tomb while wearing or carrying the complete mask. Without it, the curse takes effect. Historical accounts describe victims experiencing visions of flying birds before succumbing to a wasting illness. Li-Ming's voice dropped. Birds with ribbon-like tails. Jane recalled Miss Liu's delirious mention of silk birds, like those your father's driver claimed to see before losing consciousness. Yes, the early stages of the curse. Li-Ming looked grim. If my father has been taken to the tomb without the complete mask for protection, they were interrupted by distant shouts. The British soldiers were moving deeper into the monastery. We must leave, Li-Ming urged, carefully returning the journal to its cabinet. There's a hidden exit that leads to the mountainside. As they prepared to depart, Jane made a swift decision. Wait. She removed a sheet of paper from her notebook, quickly sketching what she had observed in Chen's journal. The cave entrance location, key landmarks, and the 4-part protection ritual described in his notes. What are you doing? Li-Ming asked. Setting a trap, Jane replied, continuing to write. If I'm correct about who has orchestrated these events, this may be our best chance to save your father. They exited through a concealed door behind a stone Buddha, emerging onto a narrow mountain path just as shouting erupted from within the monastery. The monks had apparently ceased their cooperation with the military search. Under cover of darkness, they made their way down to where Li Ming's driver waited with the motorcar. Jane directed him to take them not to the Chen residence or her hotel, but to the governor's mansion. "Why there?" Li Ming questioned as they drove through the night. "Because that's where our third mask fragment will be delivered," Jane explained, showing Li Ming the note she had written. "Along with information suggesting the final piece and the complete map, can be found at Lion Rock at midnight tomorrow. You're creating false information?" "Not entirely false." Jane's expression was determined in the dim light of the car. "The location is correct, but the timing is misleading. And I've included certain details only someone who has seen Chen's journal would know. Who will receive this note? I'm having it delivered to 3 locations simultaneously: the governor's residence, Professor Reed's quarters, and Colonel Harrington's office. Only our true adversary will recognize its significance and act upon it." Li Ming studied Jane with new appreciation. "And then?" "Then we arrive at Lion Rock before them. Tonight, not tomorrow, and set our trap." Jane gazed out at the dark landscape of Hong Kong, her mind racing ahead to the confrontation to come. "Your father may already be there, taken by someone who believes they understand the ritual but lacks the complete mask. Without all 4 pieces of the mask, entering the tomb means death," Li Ming whispered. "Then we must bring what pieces we have," Jane said firmly, "and be prepared to face someone who believes they've outsmarted both the ancient guardians and us." As their car wound through the darkened streets toward Government House, Jane felt the weight of the jade fragment in her pocket. 2 pieces recovered, 2 still missing, along with Chen Wei and the truth behind the elaborate deception that had begun with a theft in a silken pavilion. The scattered pieces of the mask were like the case itself, broken fragments that, when finally assembled, would reveal a picture far more complex and dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. Chapter 8. The lion's Shadow Lion Rock loomed against the night sky, its distinctive silhouette living up to its name, even in darkness. Jane and Li Ming left their motorcar on a seldom-used forest track, proceeding on foot through dense undergrowth, guided only by the slim beam of Jane's electric torch. The night was alive with sounds, cicadas pulsing in rhythmic waves, the distant calls of night birds, and occasionally the rustle of some small creature disturbed by their passage. Despite the relative coolness of the evening, humidity clung to them like a second skin. "The entrance should be on the eastern face," Li Ming whispered, consulting a hand-drawn copy she'd made of her father's notes. Concealed behind a formation resembling a dragon's claw, they moved with deliberate care, aware that any misstep might alert their quarry, or worse, trigger ancient protections said to guard the tomb. Jane had donned practical attire for this expedition, a dark divided skirt allowing freedom of movement and a close-fitting jacket with ample pockets. She carried a small revolver tucked discreetly in her waistband, a necessity she hoped would remain unused. As they rounded the base of the massive rock formation, Jane extinguished her torch. A head, barely visible against the stone, flickered the unmistakable glow of lantern light. "Someone is already here," she murmured, motioning for Li Ming to remain still. They crept forward until voices became audible, a man speaking in clipped, precise Cantonese and another responding in pained, halting phrases. The second voice caused Li Ming to tense beside Jane. "My father," she breathed, so softly it might have been merely a thought. Jane touched her arm in silent warning. They needed to assess the situation before revealing themselves. Edging closer, they found a position behind a massive boulder that offered both concealment and a view of the scene beyond. A narrow fissure in the rock face had been widened into a rough doorway. Before it stood 3 figures illuminated by a single hurricane lamp. Chen Wei knelt on the ground, his elegant attire now torn and soiled, his hands bound before him. Behind him stood a muscular European man Jane recognized as one of Colonel Harrington's subordinate officers. And facing Chen, a slim figure whose voice had first reached them, Professor Reed. Except he was no longer attired as an academic. Gone were the tweed jacket and spectacles, replaced by dark, practical clothing similar to Jane's own. His movements as he circled Chen were fluid and precise. Temple-trained, as Chen had written. The ritual, Mr. Chen. Once more. Reed's Cantonese was flawless, without a trace of European accent. The complete incantation, if you please. Chen's response was defiant silence. The military officer gripped his shoulder threateningly. "Your stubbornness serves no purpose," Reed continued, reverting to English. "I have 2 pieces of the mask already. The third will arrive at the governor's residence momentarily, where my associate will retrieve it. And the fourth—" He smiled, thinly. "I believe your daughter will deliver it directly to us, once she receives my message." "She is too wise to trust anything from you," Chen replied, his voice hoarse but dignified. "Perhaps, but her filial devotion is predictable." Reed checked his pocket watch. "Dawn approaches. We cannot delay further. The alignment will not be optimal again for another 60 years. Jane studied the scene, noting details rapidly. Both men were armed. Reed with a small pistol similar to her own, the officer with a military revolver. 2 of the jade mask fragments lay on a silk cloth near the cave entrance, their broken edges a perfect match. Most concerning, Reed wore around his neck what appeared to be a traditional scholar's jade pendant, the exact green hue of the mask. "The third fragment," Jane whispered to Li Ming, "disguised as jewellery." 3 pieces may be sufficient, Reed told Chen. "The texts are ambiguous regarding the necessity of complete restoration." "They are not ambiguous to those who can truly read them," Chen replied. "Enter with an incomplete mask, and the curse will claim you before you reach the burial chamber." Reed's expression hardened. "Then provide the proper ritual, and your daughter will have no need to test that theory with the final piece." Jane had seen enough. Carefully, she withdrew the jade fragment from her pocket and pressed it into Li Ming's hand. "I'm going to create a distraction," she whispered. "When I do, move to the right of that outcropping. You'll be able to see them, but they won't see you." "What are you planning?" "A strategic play," Jane replied, her eyes never leaving the tableau before them. "When the moment comes, you'll know what to do." Before Li Ming could protest, Jane had slipped away, circling wide to approach the cave entrance from the opposite direction. She waited until Reed's attention was fully focused on Chen, then deliberately dislodged a small cascade of pebbles from the slope above them. The effect was immediate. Both Reed and the officer drew their weapons, scanning the darkness. "Check. It," Reed ordered. The officer hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his post. "Now, Lieutenant Morris, if it's the girl, we need her unharmed." As the lieutenant moved toward the source of the sound, Jane emerged from behind a boulder to the left of the cave entrance, directly in their line of sight. "Good evening, Professor," she called calmly. "Or should I address you differently now?" Reed recovered quickly from his surprise, though his pistol remained trained on her. "Miss Parsons, how remarkably persistent you are!" His cultured British accent had returned. "I admire your deductive abilities, though I confess I had hoped to conclude our business without your involvement." "Your business being the looting of an ancient tomb, I presume?" Jane remained perfectly still, aware of Lieutenant Morris circling to flank her. "Such a colonial perspective," Reed replied with a thin smile. "I prefer to think of it as reclamation. The treasures of Chen Lin's tomb belong to China, not to the British Empire that would surely claim them once discovered, nor to a thief who would sell them to the highest bidder," Chen added bitterly. Reed pressed the pistol against Chen's temple. "You mistake me for a common criminal, Mr. Chen. My interest is primarily academic. The formula for immortality described in Chen Lin's manuscripts would transform our understanding of ancient Chinese alchemy, and prove quite valuable to certain interested parties," Jane observed. "Naturally." Reed's smile never reached his eyes. Knowledge and profit need not be mutually exclusive. Lieutenant Morris had completed his circuit and now stood behind Jane, his revolver aimed at her back. "She's alone, sir." A flicker of confusion crossed Reed's face. "Alone? Where is Miss Chen?" Perhaps she received different information. Jane suggested, "Your notes about Lion Rock were rather ambiguous." Reed's expression darkened. "Search her," he commanded Morris. "The fourth fragment must be on her person." As the lieutenant approached, Jane raised her hands slowly. "I'm unarmed, Lieutenant, though I wonder if Colonel Harrington would approve of your current activities. Assisting in the murder of a prominent Chinese merchant would hardly advance your military career." Morris hesitated, uncertainty crossing his face. "Sir, perhaps we should—" "Search her," Reed snapped, his careful facade cracking. "She's playing for time." The lieutenant roughly patted down Jane's jacket and skirt, finding nothing. "She doesn't have it, sir." Reed's face contorted with frustration. "Where is it, Miss Parsons? Where is the final piece?" Jane met his gaze calmly. "Hidden, Professor. Like so many pieces of this puzzle. The jade mask, your true identity, the real reason for your interest in the Chen family records." She took a measured step forward. "Did you truly believe breaking the mask would circumvent its protective power?" The text suggested the mask could be deconstructed and reconstructed as part of the ritual, Reed replied, his academic curiosity momentarily overriding his anger, each fragment representing one of the 4 sacred directions. From the shadows beyond Reed's vision, Jane saw Li Ming moving silently into position, the 4th fragment of jade clutched in her hand. Their eyes met briefly. Understanding passed between them. "An interesting theory," Jane commented, drawing Reed's full attention. "But incomplete, like your mask. The ritual requires all 4 pieces to be reunited at precisely the moment of entry. Otherwise, she glanced meaningfully at the night sky, where dark clouds had begun to gather despite the earlier clear weather. A distant rumble of thunder punctuated her words, causing Lieutenant Morris to glance nervously upward. Chen remained kneeling, but Jane noticed his posture had subtly shifted, his bound hands now positioned differently. The curse manifests first as atmospheric disturbance, Jane continued, improvising based on Li Ming's earlier descriptions. Then come the birds, harbingers of what follows. As if summoned by her words, a night bird called sharply from nearby. Morris startled visibly. Superstitious nonsense, Reed declared, though his voice held less conviction than before. Native myths designed to protect burial treasures from discovery. Perhaps, Jane conceded, but are you willing to risk it? To enter that tomb with only 3 pieces, when the 4th... She smiled enigmatically. Is so very close at hand? Reed's gaze darted between Jane and the cave entrance, calculation evident in his expression. The perfect moment had arrived. Now, Li Ming, Jane called. Chapter 9. The reveal Li Ming stepped from the shadows, the final jade fragment gleaming in her outstretched palm. At her appearance, Lieutenant Morris swung his revolver in her direction, but his movement was arrested by the unmistakable click of a hammer being cocked behind him. "I wouldn't advise that, Lieutenant," came Colonel Harrington's voice, stern and commanding. The colonel emerged from the darkness, his service revolver trained steadily on Morris. Behind him, 4 armed soldiers moved into position, surrounding the area. Reed's face registered genuine shock. "Colonel, this is unexpected." "Is it?" Harrington's expression was granite. "I received Miss Parsons' note, as you did. Unlike you, I took the time to verify certain inconsistencies." Jane used the momentary distraction to move toward Chen Wei. With swift, practiced movements, she united his bonds while keeping her attention on Reed, whose composure was rapidly deteriorating. "Your true identity is quite interesting, Professor," Harrington continued, "or should I say, Sergeant Michael Fang of the Royal Hong Kong Regiment, dishonorably discharged in 1910 for theft of artifacts from the governor's collection." Reed, or Feng, tightened his grip on his pistol. "The British have plundered China's treasures for centuries. I merely sought to restore balance." "Dun, selling to private collectors in America?" Jane asked mildly, helping Chen to his feet. "That hardly seems like cultural restoration." Feng's eyes darted between his adversaries, calculating odds that were rapidly shifting against him. The immortality formula alone would fetch enough to repatriate hundreds of artifacts. "If it exists at all," Chen said, rubbing his chafed wrists, "the so-called formula is not what you imagine. It is spiritual wisdom, not an elixir." "Lies!" Feng hissed. "The historical records are clear. Chen Lin discovered the secret to prolonging life unnaturally. Why else would the Emperor have turned against him?" Another rumble of thunder rolled across the night sky. Closer now. The storm was approaching rapidly, unnatural in its sudden intensity. "Your plans are finished, Feng," Harrington declared. "Lieutenant Morris will face court-martial for his part in this affair, and you'll return to prison." He gestured to his men. "Take them." As the soldiers moved forward, Feng made his desperate play. In one fluid motion, He grabbed the two masks, fragments from the silk cloth, and leapt towards the cave entrance. "The mask pieces! Together they protect!" he shouted, clutching the third fragment at his throat. "Stop him!" Chen cried with unexpected urgency. Without the proper ritual. But Feng had already disappeared into the narrow fissure, his figure swallowed by darkness. Lieutenant Morris, seeing his accomplice escape, attempted to follow, but was quickly subdued by Harrington's men. "He doesn't understand." Li Ming's voice was tight with apprehension. "The mask protects only when complete and properly consecrated." A strange, keening wind began to emanate from the cave entrance, carrying with it the scent of ancient dust and something sharper, more metallic. Jane and Li Ming exchanged glances. "We need to follow him," Jane said to Harrington. "He has 3 pieces of the mask, and in his desperation, he may disturb forces he doesn't comprehend." The colonel hesitated, military pragmatism warring with the undeniable strangeness unfolding before them. "My men can—" "No," Chen interrupted firmly. "Only those with knowledge of the ritual should enter. Your men would be at risk." He turned to his daughter. "Li Ming knows the protective incantations. She and Miss Parsons must go." "I'll accompany them," Harrington conceded, holstering his sidearm and retrieving a torch from one of his soldiers. Li Ming approached Jane, offering the 4th fragment. "We must reunite all pieces before he reaches the burial chamber." Jane accepted the jade piece, its weight surprisingly substantial for its size. "Will it still work if we reconstruct it outside of Feng's possession?" "The mask serves truth, not individuals," Chen replied. "If your intentions are pure, it will protect you." As they prepared to enter the cave, Chen caught his daughter's arm. "The final incantation," he murmured, speaking several phrases in an ancient dialect. Li Ming nodded gravely, repeating the words until her father was satisfied. The cave entrance was barely wide enough for one person to pass through at a time. Jane led, followed by Li Ming, with Harrington bringing up the rear. The beam of the colonel's torch revealed a narrow passage that descended steeply, ancient steps worn smooth by centuries of rain and sporadic use. The tomb was deliberately placed to appear abandoned, Li Ming explained softly as they descended. Chen Lin's enemies believed they had erased him from history. His true followers ensured his legacy would endure in secret. The passage widened suddenly into a small antechamber. On the floor lay Feng's abandoned torch, still burning. 3 tunnels branched outward from this central point. "Which way?" Harrington demanded. Li Ming studied the wall inscriptions, barely visible in the torchlight. "The central passage, but we must proceed with caution. The floor, her warning came too late." From deeper within the central tunnel came a cry of pain and shock, followed by an ominous rumbling. "Trap," Jane concluded grimly. "He's triggered the tomb's defences." They advanced carefully, testing each step before committing their weight. The central passage twisted downward, the air growing increasingly stale and heavy with mineral scents. The rumbling had ceased, but in its place came a sound more disturbing, a soft rhythmic fluttering, like countless wings beating against still air. They found Feng in a broader chamber, adorned with faded murals depicting imperial court scenes. He was on his knees, clutching his arm where a dart protruded from his sleeve, his face contorted in pain. Before him stood a massive stone door, carved with the image of birds in flight. "It's happening," he gasped upon seeing them, his eyes wide with dawning terror. "The birds! They're coming for me!" Jane saw nothing but shadows dancing in the torchlight, yet Feng's gaze tracked invisible movements with growing panic. Iyuchir. 3 mask fragments lay scattered where he had dropped them. "He's experiencing the first stage of the curse," Li Ming whispered. "The hallucinations." "Can it be stopped?" Jane asked, kneeling to gather the fallen jade pieces. "Only by completing the mask and performing the ritual before—" Li Ming didn't finish the thought. Jane placed all 4 fragments on the stone floor, arranging them to match the drawing she had seen. The broken edges aligned perfectly, revealing the complete face of a serene deity with inscriptions running along its border. Feng watched their actions with desperate hope. "Fix it," he pleaded. His academic arrogance evaporated. "Please, they're everywhere now." Li Ming began the incantation Chen had taught her, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. As she spoke, Jane noticed an extraordinary phenomenon. The fragmented mask appeared to soften at its broken edges, the jade becoming momentarily malleable like warm wax. "Together," Li Ming instructed, never breaking the rhythm of her chant. "All hands." Jane placed her fingers on one fragment, gesturing for Harrington to do the same with another. Li Ming maintained her chant, touching the 3rd piece, while Feng, comprehending their intent, reached trembling fingers toward the 4th. As the final words of the incantation echoed in the ancient chamber, they pressed the fragments together. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft green luminescence, the jade pieces fused seamlessly, the mask whole once more. The fluttering sound ceased abruptly. Feng's expression cleared, his terror replaced by astonishment. "It's real," he whispered. "All of it. The curse, the protection." His gaze fixed on the stone door before them. "And what lies beyond?" Jane lifted the reunited mask carefully. "The question now becomes, do we proceed or return to the surface?" The restored mask seemed to pulse with subtle energy in her hands, responding to the ancient power invested in this sacred place. Outside, the storm had reached its peak, the distant thunder now directly overhead. Within the tomb or without, they stood at the threshold of revelation. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The massive stone door yielded to their combined strength, ancient mechanisms groaning to life after centuries of stillness. As it swung open, the restored jade mask in Jane's hands emitted a soft green luminescence that intensified, providing unexpected illumination that rendered their torches nearly redundant. The burial chamber beyond defied their expectations. No glittering treasure hoard awaited, no stacks of gold or precious gems. Instead, the circular room housed a single stone sarcophagus at its center, surrounded by shelves carved from the living rock. Upon these rested row upon row of bamboo scrolls, hundreds of them, their surfaces darkened with age, but remarkably preserved in the dry, sealed environment. "Chen Lin's true legacy," Li Ming breathed, her voice hushed with reverence. "Knowledge, not wealth." Feng staggered forward. His injured arm clutched against his chest, disbelief etched across his features. "But the legends," The immortality formula is here, Leeming confirmed, approaching one particular shelf, where scrolls bearing imperial seals were prominently displayed. But not as you imagined it, Jane followed, the mask's glow providing perfect illumination, as Leeming carefully unrolled one of the ancient texts. The characters were archaic, but Jane recognized diagrams of plants, astronomical configurations, and the human form in various meditative postures. Chen Lin discovered that certain combinations of meditation, dietary practices, and herbal compounds could extend life significantly. Leeming explained, her finger tracing the ancient text. Not immortality as Westerners conceive it, but a harmonious extension of natural life through balance. Colonel Harrington examined the chamber with military precision, his initial skepticism giving way to reluctant wonder. No gold, no jewels. The Emperor executed those who followed Chen Lin's teachings because they challenged the imperial monopoly on longevity practices. Leeming continued. Chen Lin's crime was not possessing the secret, but sharing it beyond the palace walls. Hongis sank to his knees before the scrolls, his grand scheme of profit evaporating before his eyes. All this for philosophical texts and meditation instructions. Knowledge that could transform human understanding of longevity, Jane observed. Perhaps not the quick fortune you envisioned, but potentially more valuable in the right hands. They spoke. Jane noticed a subtle change in the chamber's atmosphere. The mask's glow had begun to pulse in rhythm with some unseen force, and upon the walls, the painted figures of birds, previously static, appeared to shimmer with suggestion of movement. "We should not linger," Leeming warned, noticing the same phenomenon. "The mask has fulfilled its purpose in guiding us safely to this place, but its protection is not eternal." Harrington nodded briskly. "What of these scrolls? They belong in a museum where scholars can study them properly." "They belong to the Chen family," Jane corrected gently, "who have protected this knowledge for centuries at great personal risk." A standoff might have ensued, but at that moment Feng let out a strangled cry. The dart wound on his arm had begun to blacken around the edges, the poison's progress temporarily halted by the mask's protection, now resuming its deadly work. "Help me!" he gasped, reaching toward the mask in Jane's hands. Leeming knelt beside him, examining the wound with grim expertise. The tomb's defenses are ancient but effective. The poison is rare, derived from a plant that grows only on certain mountain slopes. "Is there an antidote?" Jane asked. "Yes, but we must reach the surface quickly. My father will know which herbs to prepare." She looked at Feng with complex emotions crossing her face, anger at his deception and theft, yet compassion for his suffering. Harrington made a swift decision that spoke to unexpected depths beneath his colonial exterior. "Take what scrolls you can carry now," he instructed Leeming. I give you my word that arrangements will be made for the rest to be properly documented and preserved according to your family's wishes." As Leeming carefully selected several key texts, Jane turned her attention to the sarcophagus. Of the stone, lid bore an inscription that matched the characters on the mask's edge. A prayer for safe passage between worlds. With gentle reverence, she placed the restored mask upon the sarcophagus. "It belongs here," she said simply, guarding its master as intended. The mask's glow pulsed once more, then stabilized into a steady emerald luminescence that seemed to suffuse the entire chamber. On the walls, the painted birds settled into stillness once again. Their ascent to the surface was considerably less dramatic than their descent. Fung, supported between Harrington and Jane, struggled against the poison's advancement but remained conscious. Li-Ming led the way, the precious scrolls secured in a makeshift sling across her back. Dawn was breaking as they emerged from the cave entrance, the storm having passed during their time underground. Chen Wei awaited them with Harrington's men, his relief at seeing his daughter evident in his embrace. "The mask?" he asked after ensuring Li-Ming was unharmed. "Returned to its rightful place," Jane replied, guarding Chen Lin and his knowledge. A complex mixture of emotions crossed Chen's face: relief, regret, and ultimately acceptance. "It is as it should be." His attention turned to Fung, now lying on an improvised stretcher. Without hesitation, Chen instructed his driver to prepare specific herbs from a case he had brought. "Even he deserves mercy," Chen said quietly to Jane. "The curse has made its point." In the days that followed, the official narrative of events took shape with careful diplomatic precision. The stolen jade mask was reported destroyed in an unfortunate accident during its recovery. Lieutenant Morris faced court-martial for his role in the affair, while Fung, recovering slowly from the poison under Chen's reluctant care, awaited trial for theft and kidnapping. More significant were the quiet arrangements made between the British authorities and the Chen family. A formal agreement was drawn up, acknowledging the Chen family's custodianship of Chen Lin's scrolls, while ensuring scholars from both East and West would have limited, supervised access to study their contents. On her final evening in Hong Kong, Jane found herself once again in the governor's garden, though this time without the festive decorations of the ill-fated party. Li-Ming joined her beside a reflecting pool, where lotus flowers floated serenely on the dark water. "My father tells me you've declined the governor's reward," Li-Ming said, after they had stood in companionable silence for some moments. Jane smiled, slightly. "Money has never been my primary motivation." "What is, then? What drives Jane Parsons to solve mysteries that others cannot?" The question deserved honest consideration. Jane watched a nightingale alight on a nearby branch, its song piercing the evening quiet. "Understanding, I suppose," she answered finally. "Not merely of events and their causes, but of people, their hopes, fears, and the secrets they keep, even from themselves." Li-Ming nodded thoughtfully. "The scrolls speak of this as the highest wisdom, to understand others so completely that their actions become transparent, like viewing fish through clear water. And yet complete understanding remains elusive," Jane observed. "We all retain mysteries, even to ourselves." "Will you write about this case?" Li-Ming asked. "Many would find it fascinating. Some aspects, perhaps. Others will remain between those of us who experienced them." Jane turned to face the younger woman directly. The vision of birds that Miss Liu described, that Fung experienced in the tomb. Did you see them as well? Li-Ming's expression grew thoughtful. "Did you?" The women exchanged a glance of perfect understanding. Some mysteries were meant to remain personal, respected rather than exposed. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chen Wei, accompanied by Colonel Harrington. The two men, representatives of vastly different worlds, had reached an unexpected accord in the aftermath of their shared experience. "Miss Parsons," Chen bowed slightly. "My family is in your debt." "Not at all, Mr. Chen. I merely helped reveal truths that were already present." Harrington cleared his throat. "Your steamer leaves for Singapore tomorrow morning. I've taken the liberty of upgrading your accommodations as a small token of the governor's appreciation." Jane accepted this gesture with grace, though her thoughts were already turning toward the journey ahead. Hong Kong had offered her not just a mystery to solve, but a rare glimpse into a world where ancient wisdom and modern ambition collided in ways both destructive and illuminating. Later that night, as she packed her trunks, Jane paused to record final notes in her journal. Beyond the facts of the case, the theft, the deception, the ancient tomb with its unexpected contents, lay deeper truths about human nature that formed the real heart of her investigation. Greed had motivated Feng's elaborate scheme, certainly, but also a genuine belief in the transformative power of Chen Lin's knowledge. Pride had driven Lieutenant Morris to betray his uniform. Yet that same pride had ultimately led Harrington to choose justice over colonial acquisition. The Chen family's devotion to their ancestor represented not mere superstition, but a profound respect for continuity and wisdom passed through generations. As Jane closed her journal, she noticed a small package on her writing desk that had not been there earlier. Wrapped in red silk and sealed with wax bearing the Chen family crest, it contained a miniature jade carving of a bird with ribbon-like tail, not ancient but newly crafted. The accompanying note, written in Li Ming's elegant hand, read simply, "Some guardians watch from a distance. Safe journey." Jane smiled as she placed the carving carefully among her possessions. Tomorrow would bring a new destination, eventually a new mystery to unravel. But tonight, as the sounds of Hong Kong drifted through her open window, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The stolen mask had been returned to its rightful place. Justice had been served with both firmness and mercy, and ancient wisdom had been preserved while allowing for new understanding. In her experience, such balanced resolutions were rare indeed, as precious and worthy of protection as any jade mask or ancient scroll. Like the birds with ribbon tails, some mysteries were meant to soar between worlds, connecting past and present, east and west, the seen and unseen realms of human experience. Jane Parsons, ever the observer, would continue to watch their flight with keen interest and quiet respect. After all, in her profession, the most valuable treasures were rarely those made of gold or jade, but the elegantly layered truths that emerged when deception was stripped away, revealing the complex human hearts beneath.